Welcome, friends, to Lesson 6. This lesson is all about working with transparency inside Illustrator CS3. Now, I've gone and opened up the next project file that we'll be working on, so go ahead and do the same. Head to the Project Files folder on your desktop into Part 1, and then inside your Lesson 6 folder, you'll find phantombots.ai, and that's going to be our project file here that we'll be working on. Now, inside the Phantom Bots file here, we have some text obviously here, which I've outlined for us. I put a gradient onto our text here, which we'll be messing around with later on, as well as our robot heads here, of course. And there's also a mask happening in the background, which you saw how to do earlier. So we're going to come back to our robots here in just a little bit, but I want to get you started working with transparency in a more basic way. That's sort of been our theme throughout our series here. We start with a basic concept and then apply it to a project file. So if you want to pan away just a little bit, I'm just holding down my space bar here. Give yourself a little bit of space to work with. And I always like to start off just by showing this with some basic shapes here. So go ahead and grab any of your shape tools here, fill them with whatever colors you'd like. And we want at least 3 shapes. They can be the same shapes, it doesn't really matter. But make sure that each of your shapes are filled with a different color. That's the important part here. If you've ever worked with transparency and opacity and so on in Photoshop, you'll find working in Illustrator is going to be a breeze for you. So I have a collection of shapes here and I want to begin applying some basic transparency. It's very, very easy in Illustrator. The first thing that I'm going to do is go and grab my transparency palette from the right hand side. Go ahead and do the same there. And I'll start with my first object here, my green star, which I drew. And I get a little thumbnail preview inside the transparency palette as well. Now, I'll start off with the easy stuff, opacity. So I'm going to drop down my little opacity slider here. I just clicked on that little tiny right arrow there, and that displays a little opacity slider, which I can begin dragging around here. And right away you can see back on my artwork, I have this transparency happening. I can see the oval showing through underneath here. So that's obviously the idea here. This is what we're after. And of course I can grab another shape. The thumbnail preview updates there for me, and I can continue adjusting the opacity for each of my objects here. Now where things get interesting here is when I take the object in the back and begin adjusting its opacity, and of course that's going to affect the areas that are underneath some of my other shapes here. So applying basic transparency, basic opacity here in Illustrator is very, very simple. Where things get really fun is when I start messing around with blending modes. Once again, if you're familiar with Photoshop, you'll know that blending modes are applied to layers. Every layer in Photoshop has its own set of opacities and its own set of blending modes. Well, the concept is the same here in Illustrator, except now I can apply blending modes and opacity to individual objects, not an entire layer all in one shot. So grab one of your objects here, and inside my transparency palette, I can drop down the blending mode menu. These blending modes are right out of Photoshop. And the idea, if you've never worked with blending modes before, the idea here is to create different color effects between my overlapping objects here. So you can see different color transitions, color effects happening here. And that's really what a blending mode does. It's the interaction of overlapping colors here. So it's the interaction between my green here and the dark purple that I have in the background on my oval here. So you can see what's happening there. So it's really a matter of experimenting with your different blending modes. And if you want a rundown of exactly what each of these blending modes are doing, you can certainly dig into Illustrator's help and it'll give you a breakdown of every single one of these. But how I think of these is I think of them as almost like mathematical computations based on color here. So take the color on the overlapping object and multiply it or combine it or compute it against the color in the other underlying objects. So that's sort of the idea here with blending modes. And of course I can continue stacking more and more objects on top of each other to achieve different effects here. So that's sort of a basic run through of working with opacity and setting your transparency.